All right, cool. Well, I'll go ahead and start off with, first of all, I wanted to recognize Joey Abdullah, who's here. I know it seems like a lot of the guys that are in the chat box that are here watching know him. He's our sponsor for tonight. He is the, I guess I would say, president and general manager of Belco Home Loans, which everybody I think knows Belco Credit Union here in Colorado. And he's heading up their mortgage division now. So he generously sponsored tonight. He values information and economic updates as much as I do. So appreciate you, Joey. If you have anything you want to share, man, please take a minute and do so.
I appreciate it, Drew. I mean, honestly, anytime I can link up and be a part of any sort of information that's being presented correctly, right? There's always a fondness that I have for economic research, and a lot of the time, effort, energy goes into getting all the data gathered and then presented by someone like Patty. It's always an honor to be a part of it. So appreciate, Patty, you taking your time as well today, and Drew for facilitating this. So happy to be here.
Awesome. All right. Well, that sounds good, man. Thanks a lot again. I really appreciate you. And I want to introduce Patty. If anybody was around last year, we hosted a similar talk right before COVID shut us all down. It was amazing. I think it was around the end of February. We were talking about the economy and how great it was, and then things changed, at least briefly. So we are doing the same thing this time. Patty Silverstein is the president and chief economist for Development Research Partners here in Littleton and the Denver area. And she's going to walk us through a bunch of information. Again, please feel free to bring up any questions you might have, and we'll make it a great, valuable session for all of us. Hope you take away some helpful things for your business or for whatever you're in. All right. Thanks, Patty. You go ahead and take it from here.
All right. Thanks so much, Drew. Hi, everybody. I think, Drew, that this group had one of the dubious distinctions of being one of the last groups that I met with in person last year. I think there may have been one other event after this, but since that point, everything has been virtual. How we can all relate to that, but anyway. So I'm delighted to be here. And as Drew had mentioned, if you do run into, have questions, or maybe there's a topic that you want to discuss in a little more detail as I present it, please do jump in, unmute yourself, ask a question, or put something in the chat or whatever. Drew is going to be kind of monitoring that for me as well. So anyway, kind of want to keep this a dialogue here. So, all right, so let's talk about this past year, where we've been, and hopefully a little bit more too about where we see everything headed. And you'll see that this year, I'm going to be talking about tracking the Great Divide. There's been a lot of discussion about, is this whole recovery, is it going to be a W or a V or a check mark or whatever? And then a lot of people have talked about it as a K-shaped recovery. Well, I kind of grasped onto the whole K idea, not because I think it describes necessarily our recovery, but rather it describes our reality, where we are at right now. All of us have been experiencing this whole COVID recession very differently, and it differs according to what industry you're in, what type of age group you're in, what type of commercial real estate or residential real estate you are dealing with. But it has definitely been that this has been a recession that has impacted people very, very differently. And that's really going to be one of the key themes of this forecast discussion today. So I'm going to start by taking a very quick look at what's going on globally, what's going on nationally, and then we're going to drill down into what we see happening in terms of employment activity, commercial real estate a bit, then consumer activity, and then we'll wrap it up with residential real estate, because I know that's near and dear to all of your hearts here. So we're going to, that's kind of the agenda, if you will, for this evening. So please feel free, though, to jump in and make this a dialogue as we go through. So first of all, in terms of the global situation, yes, COVID has been influencing economic activity all across the globe. And we certainly mourn those folks that have died from this, those folks that have been infected. And because of the varying degrees of openness all across the globe, because COVID has not been acting in a similar manner in all countries, in all areas, because it's definitely has depended upon various business restrictions and that type of thing that have been put in place. So this whole degree of openness means that it is creating some worldwide supply and demand challenges. I mean, sometimes you may order a good and you're thinking, aha, I'm going to be getting this in a couple of days. And then you discover, no, it's really a couple of months because of that supply chain or that whole manufacturing of that particular item. Travel restrictions, of course, have varied, which has limited business trips, pleasure trips all across the globe. But we have the vaccine. And this is the game changer. And this truly is what the whole economic forecast is dependent upon. And as I lay out our economic forecast here, you will see that our expectation is that kind of by end of summer-ish, we should be back to pretty much, dare I say, normal. But really, it is all dependent upon how successful we are in rolling that vaccine out to all of the people that indeed want it and developing that kind of herd immunity. So again, my expectation is that it's going to be sometime summer, maybe even into the fourth quarter before everybody is really feeling like, okay, it's time to move forward here once again. Because of all of the various restrictions and how COVID has influenced activity all across the globe, everywhere in 2020 saw a decline in gross domestic product for their country, with the exception of China. China was the one country that actually did post a bit of an increase, a 2.3% increase, which if you've ever tracked the Chinese economic data, that's a very, very low growth rate for them. But it was a growth rate nonetheless. 2021, we expect most all countries across the globe will actually post some type of increase. Notice here that the International Monetary Fund expects that the US growth rate will be 5.1% in 2021, that the whole globe will be the GDP across the globe all added together about 5.5%. Quite frankly, there have been a lot of different forecasts about what will happen in terms of GDP, some as low as 1%, others as high as 6.5%. And I think I saw one the other day, even expecting up to 9% growth for the US. Crazy range, because it is all dependent upon what your assumptions are regarding vaccine rollout and that type of thing. So anyway, here in the US, we have seen about $6 trillion in relief funds that have been rolled out throughout the economy since the end of March. And that could include direct payments to households, some grants, loans to businesses, tax relief measures that were put into place. That's the equivalent of about 27% of our GDP. Now, this does not include that current package that is under discussion right now in the Senate, that additional $1.9 trillion in relief funds. Again, we're expecting that will go through significant changes before it will ever hit the president's desk for signature, if it hits the president's desk for signature. So it's hard to say just how much in that final total for that relief package will be. The Federal Reserve has also maintained a very accommodative policy with that federal funds rate in the range of 0 to 0.25%. They've also, have said that they are going to keep the Fed funds rate at a very low level until we start to see employment increasing, and their trigger that they're really focused on is what is happening with inflation. And they want to see kind of what they're calling a long-term average in inflation of 2%. And we're far off from that mark right now with inflation, only in the 1%-ish type of range right now at the US level. Well, all of the relief funds, all of these measures have indeed come with a cost. Our federal budget deficit has increased from $1 trillion in 2019 to over $3 trillion in 2020. The expectation is that in 2021, that'll pull back again to about a $2.3 trillion. But that forecast from the Congressional Budget Office was also prior to that $1.9 trillion relief package being discussed. So we'll see where that ends up. You take all those annual budget deficits, add them all up, you get our total debt level of about $27 trillion right now. And if you just take the look at that portion that is held by the public, which is a frequent measure, basically where we moved to 100% of our GDP in 2020, and the expectation is that it will indeed be going up from there. So again, GDP, we focus on that because that is our broadest measure of economic activity. In 2020, we saw a 3.5% decline in overall economic activity. That was the steepest decline, that annual change, the steepest decline that we have seen since going back to the mid-1940s. Another comparable decline was back in the 1930s. So this is very unprecedented. As I had suggested, though, our expectation for 2021 is kind of right in the mid-range of these very extreme forecasts for GDP. Our forecast is that we'll see about a 4% increase in GDP, again, with the idea that activity starts to pick up in summer, really solidifies in the fourth quarter of this year. So let's talk now about our labor force and employment. What are we seeing in terms of those great divides that are out here? So I want to frame this whole discussion about what we're seeing with our labor force and employment in terms of our average weekly wages, as a way to kind of demonstrate how indeed we are experiencing COVID and this COVID recession in a very different manner, depending upon what type of industry you're in. So this takes a look at our average weekly wage in the Metro Denver region by the various super sectors. So all businesses that operate out in our economy are put into one of these buckets or one of these super sectors, depending upon the good or service that they are delivering. So at the top of the list, the green bars are those that I would refer to as the high wage super sectors. Our highest paid super sector is information. Information includes some print media, but it's also all of our telecommunications companies. And what is really driving this high wage is the fact that it includes a lot of high tech companies. Think Google, for example. Google obviously is really one of the key information providers, if you will, out there, because whenever you whenever you try to do any type of web searching, the Google framework and all, or all of those the internet hosting services are really providing us with that information, that connectivity to that information. So that's the highest paid super sector at $2,300 per week. On to our lowest super sector. At the bottom of the list there in red would be what I would regard as the low wage super sectors there. The lowest paid super sector being leisure and hospitality. That's all of our restaurants. That's our hotels. That's all of our entertainment venues that we miss oh so much. That lowest wage then at $550 per week. Now, I should note, however, that that does not include any type of tips, and that can be significant for our companies that are in the leisure and hospitality, especially our restaurant industry. So if you were to add that in, it would bump up that salary a bit, but I would still suggest that they would still end up in that that low wage super sector arena there. In yellow there, those are the mid-wage industries, including manufacturing, construction, government, transportation, warehousing, and utilities. I want to call out that one just for a moment. Transportation, yes, it includes all of our aviation activities, but on the warehousing side, that's where we find the e-commerce logistical types of operations. It's where Amazon is going to be classified, is there in the warehousing segment there. So that gives you kind of a framework there that I want you to be thinking about as we move forward into this discussion about what we see happening in terms of our employment. So first, before we get to who is employed in our economy, let's talk about who is unemployed in our economy. So first of all, if you look at the chart on the left, that's our labor force participation rate, which is basically taking a look at all of our entire population, 16 years old and over, what percentage of the people are actually either out there working now or are actively engaged in trying to find a job. They're a part of the labor force. That labor force participation rate has gone and really plummeted with the introduction of COVID and has been up and down here in Colorado. In general, our labor force participation rate is significantly higher than what we see happening at the national level. But what is important about this is, again, this up and down movement in our labor force participation rate, because if you drop out of the labor force, say you are a parent that has to stay home to monitor your child's remote education program, maybe you've reached a point that you've just said, I can't work and do this teaching job here at the same time. And so I am just not even going to pursue finding other employment. When you drop out of the labor force, you are no longer counted as unemployed, which means you are no longer counted in our unemployment rate. And so that's why when we take a look at our unemployment rate, this chart on the right-hand side, we see that the average unemployment rate for 2020 did not reach the same levels that we experienced during the Great Recession, mainly because our labor force has been more constricted this time around than it was during the Great Recession. We saw that as people have dropped out, again, it looks great. It's like, oh, that unemployment rate, it's so low. Well, it's deceptively low because, again, people had dropped out of that labor force. Indeed, right after in April of 2020 was kind of the worst month in terms of the significance of unemployment and the decline in jobs, all of the layoff activities, that type of thing. During April of 2020 in the Metro Denver region, our unemployment rate reached 12.1%. Started backing off all throughout the summer, started to get a little bit of a tick upwards once again towards the end of November, beginning of December, again, as we saw a resurgence in some of those COVID cases and a resurgence then in business restrictions. We saw that whole resurgence in terms of the unemployed out there. But nonetheless, the expectation then is that in 2021, we'll start to see this unemployment rate start to back down. Once again, we won't reach those levels that we had prior to the pandemic. I mean, we were tracking at rates that were oh so incredibly low before that, but we do expect that unemployment rate will come down by a point or two, and that we will actually see an increase once again in our labor force. one of the ways that we were tracking what was going on with unemployment was this data from the Colorado Department of Labor and Employment. They were providing on a weekly basis the number of initial claims, or those people that were first filing for unemployment insurance, and that's shown by the green line, versus also the continuing claims. Once you have been deemed eligible for unemployment insurance assistance, then you have to continue to apply each week, and they have to continue to deem you eligible to receive assistance, and that's then referred to as the continuing claims. So first of all, in terms of the initial claims, that green line, we saw that green line, as I'd mentioned, spike. April was one of our most troublesome months in terms of unemployment activity. That's when we saw that whole peak in the number of initial claims. It had started to level off. Again, you start to see this bump. If you can kind of track my cursor here, you see this bump happening kind of the end of November, beginning of December, again, when we started to have the business restrictions that went into place. Then it started to pull back again. And now we have a lot of weirdness happening. That's a very technical term too, in terms of what is happening currently with the data. So what had happened towards the end, so the end of December, when the CARES Act had expired, and before it was signed into law again, we had this whole pause in terms of unemployment insurance being paid in the system, and people even being able to apply for unemployment insurance. So some of the crazy data that we see happening right now is really now kind of a backfilling of what had happened in early January when there was a pause in the system. So it's hard to say just what the trends are right now, but I do believe in general that we're seeing unemployment again starting to level off, maybe even starting to decline a little bit again, but we're really going to need a few more weeks of data to say that again with great certainty. Bottom line on this, though, is that there have been a whole host of folks that have found themselves in an unemployed situation. You know, really on average throughout the worst of this, in terms of the continued claims, we were averaging around 250,000 to 300,000 people that were on unemployment assistance throughout our entire state of Colorado. A tragic number here in the state. So when we take a look at those claims by, again, our super sectors, again, trying to call out between the high wage, mid wage, and low wage positions, this, the last week that we had data at an industry level was the middle of December. And at that point in time, 53% of the folks that were continuing to claim unemployment insurance were in those low wage positions, predominantly leisure and hospitality, not surprisingly there. So again, this whole COVID recession has impacted people very, very differently, depending upon what industry you work in. You know, with the high wage industries, 28% of the claims were in the high wage industries, 19% in the mid wage. And again, that whole mid wage really points to a lot of the essential activities. Manufacturing operations were generally deemed essential, as were construction activities, as were a lot of the warehousing, the logistics operations, so that people could get their goods delivered to them in a fast manner. So the mid-wage industries really had done, performed fairly solidly. Even with the high wage industries, where it's 28%, and you see a lot of folks in this professional and business services category. So professional and business services includes everything from your legal and accounting services on through to architecture and design services to a lot of computer systems design. And again, you get a whole host of high-tech related industries that are classified within that. But what's also in that category would be all of the building maintenance services. So any of those business services related to janitorial services or administrative services for companies are classified in that. And that's really what was driving a lot of the continued claims in that super sector during that period of time was, again, a lot of those business, the building services activities were a bit curtailed there. So now let's turn to what we see happening in terms of employment. So we've talked about who was unemployed. Now let's talk about who has been employed. So this takes a look at, this is a map of the US, and it compares December 2020 employment with December of 2019. A few things that I want to point out about this. First of all, had we looked at this map in April of 2020, we would have seen that every single state in the country, not surprisingly, that their employment in April of 2020 was lower than it had been in April of 2019. The first month that we saw any state start to post a bit of an increase was November. And that's Idaho was the first state to report a year-over-year increase in November. Come December here then, which is shown on this map, there were two states then that actually posted a higher level of employment in December of 2020 than December 2019, and that's Utah and Idaho. So we track what happens in Utah very closely here in Colorado because it's a very competitive marketplace to us. Competitive from a tourism standpoint, competitive from just about any type of economic development, business prospect activity as well. Utah tends to be very innovative, very entrepreneurial within their economy there. So we always track them really closely. Idaho too has been coming on very, very strong and being very competitive with Colorado. So those two areas, those two states posting an increase in employment, so ranking number 1 in the country. And notice that Colorado ranks as 26. So our employment growth rate or employment loss, as the case may be, during that December time period, we were ranking right in the middle of the pack. That kind of hurts. Here in Colorado, you know, we have always prided ourselves as being one of the top 10 growth states. So what is this that we're now middle of the pack? Well, I would suggest that really one of the key reasons for this is the significance of our tourism base. So pre-pandemic, Colorado had the 7th highest concentration of leisure and hospitality employment in the country. So just as we've talked about how that leisure and hospitality is where we've seen all of those various job losses and everything, that really has been really one of the key reasons that Colorado is now performing kind of middle of the pack there. So it really points to the importance of that tourism base to our state. Yes, you know, you and I may be staycationing a bit, and we may get out there and spend some of our dollars throughout the state and that type of thing. But the lack of tourists coming from across the country, the lack of tourists coming from across the globe has certainly had a significant influence on our employment base. So looking at our employment, I want to compare this whole COVID recession to the Great Recession here. So in the Great Recession, again, if you can if I can get my cursor to kind of show up here. If you follow here, in this period of time, here's the Great Recession, we lost 155,000 jobs over 20 months. Took us then 38 months to basically get back to where we had been. The COVID recession has been oh so different. We lost 343,000 jobs in just 3 months. So we lost double the number of jobs, more than double the number of jobs, again, essentially overnight. We have since recovered about 56% of our jobs. Notice that October employment here, if you can kind of see that, is a little bit higher than it was in November and December. Again, going back to the type of business restrictions that were put in place, again, as we saw the resurgence in the COVID cases. So 56% of our jobs have been recovered as of December. And that puts us, again, right on target with what we see happening at a whole national level. Now, a couple of words about that. In 2 weeks, we are going to get revised employment data for all of 2020 and indeed going back into the kind of the middle of 2019. This is a process that they call benchmarking, where they go in and they take they recalibrate the survey data that they had been collecting every month to actual administrative records. So we will have a better sense of the how reasonable this really is. My guess, and don't be surprised when this happens, but my guess is that the job losses are going to come in as being even greater than what we had initially been tracking. So again, don't be surprised by that when that data comes out in a couple of weeks. I mean, it has just, without a doubt, has been a very severe situation. So let's talk about these various employment losses across the state. So our state includes 7 metropolitan statistical areas. These are basically our urbanized areas across the state. And we've seen that these various areas have performed very differently during this whole COVID recession. Grand Junction on our western slope, so that the Grand Junction MSA is really all of Mesa County. Their employment down by just 2%. This is an area that has a significant base of retirees. It also is an area that has a very significant outdoor recreation economy. That has been a little more stable than perhaps some of our other metropolitan statistical areas. Colorado Springs doing the second best of our urbanized areas, down by about 2.5%. Colorado Springs being, of course, influenced by military activity, also by a lot of cybersecurity companies. Those companies have kind of been gleaning into Colorado Springs and increasing their employment. And certainly with all of us either remote working, remote learning, or just the daily importance of connectivity here, cybersecurity is oh so critical and has been growing within the state of Colorado. I want to highlight then, I'm going to talk about Denver in a little more detail here, but I want to talk first of all about Greeley, Fort Collins, and Boulder. So Greeley is all of Weld County, Fort Collins being all of Larimer County, Boulder being all of Boulder County. So notice that these 3 areas have been the most challenged of our urbanized areas. Greeley has been influenced, of course, by oil and gas activity, but also what is happening in Boulder and Fort Collins, and to a certain degree there in Greeley as well, is what has been going on with our university systems. The lack of students within these areas and the lack of student spending within those areas has certainly had a challenging influence on employment activity within those respective communities. Boulder also being influenced, of course, by tourism dollars that have been severely lacking recently. But I think truly in Fort Collins and to a large degree there in Boulder and in Greeley with UNC, the lack of students, their spending, the lack of being on campus has certainly had a detrimental impact there. So those are our urbanized areas. Those are 17 counties then in Colorado that are covered by these MSAs. So that means our other 47 counties in Colorado are non-urban areas or outside of these MSAs. If we were to take all of those areas, add them up together, we would see that elsewhere throughout Colorado, employment is down by 9.3%. on average in 2020. Again, numbers to be revised in a couple of weeks here. Nonetheless, the recognition that as challenging as COVID has been along the Front Range or within our urbanized areas, recognizing that our rural parts of the state, our mountain resort parts of the state have been even more severely impacted than elsewhere in the state. So talking a little bit in a bit more detail about what has been going on in terms of Metro Denver employment, again, going back to that whole framework of high wage, mid-wage, low wage types of positions, we see that in terms of the high wage jobs, basically the recession is over. Our employment in 2020 was at really the same level as it had been in 2019. And a few things to point out related to this. So again, our information sector, our very highest paid sector, was basically flat from 2019 to 2020. We had a bit of an increase in wholesale trade activities, but an even stronger increase in professional and business services. Again, professional and business services, that broad catch-all category, this is great news. That's our largest super sector, and we saw an employment increase in that super sector that really sets the stage for our foundation, if you will, for our economic recovery. Also on the manufacturing side, this was an industry too that increased in 2020 compared to 2019. And there are a few key industries in here that are really important to our economic base in Metro Denver. When we talk about our key industry clusters or the key groupings that the economic development community that I work very closely with is really out there as serving our foundation of our economy. So industries like aerospace has saw very significant growth in 2020, and that's also important for Colorado. We have the second largest aerospace economy, second only to California. It's a very high wage sector. So the strength of that industry was very, very good news for us throughout 2020. Bioscience, boy, they have been such incredible rock stars as our various bioscience companies have been trying to find cures and trying to develop that vaccine and all of the protocols related to that. Bioscience was incredibly important. Also on our manufacturing side, one of our key industries, food and beverage production. We've continued to eat and drink, and that has served as a very important foundation for us as well. And again, going back to that professional and business services and information, the IT software industries are in those two sectors, as well as our telecommunications sector being in our information sector. So some really key industries that experienced still managed to eke out some employment growth in 2020. Versus, again, on our low wage sector, that's where we saw employment in 2020 on average down by over 8% compared to where it had been in 2019. That mid-wage position being a bit more solid as well than what we're seeing on the low wage side. So again, and just to kind of, beat on this one last time here when we talk about the employment base, depending upon what industry you are in, your experience during this whole COVID recession has been very different. Add all that up together, our expectation when those revisions come in is that Metro Denver will have lost 74,000 jobs in 2020. The state of Colorado having lost about 131,000 jobs. We will start to increase, add back those jobs once again in 2021. Notice that our expectation in 2021 is that we'll add about 48,000 jobs this year. So that means that we will not have recovered all of the jobs that we had lost by the end of 2021. indeed, I expect that it's going to be more like the end of 2022 before we add back all of those jobs that have been lost. So from the perspective of, yes, it's going to start feeling oh so much better by the middle of this year, but do recognize it is those jobs just don't happen to come back overnight. It takes time as we start to see companies scaling up again, ramping up their operations, as they start to, again, get the funding, get those dollars flowing that they can add back those workers. It's going to be a process, and likely not until the end of 2022 until we've added all of those back. So let me I want to just pause there. I've been talking. Does anybody have any questions? Otherwise we're going to leave kind of the employment side and talk about a little bit about what's happening on the commercial real estate side. But I just want to see if anybody wanted to ask any further questions at all about employment activity here. Okay, hearing none, I am going to keep plowing on forward then. So let's talk about these real estate divides, the commercial real estate divides that we are seeing. So I want to talk about this in terms of office, industrial, and retail. And these three different property types are experiencing COVID in very different manners as well. On the office market side, yes, we are seeing an increase in the vacancy rate. And in this chart, the vacancy rate is represented, the direct vacancy rate, by the green part of this column. The gray represents sublet vacancy space, and then the red line represents the amount of new construction activity. So we've seen an increase in the vacancy rate in Metro Denver, and a significant increase in the amount of sublet space too out on the marketplace. And the big part of the discussion is, will we ever go back to the office, or have those folks, those office workers, just become accustomed now to remote work, and companies have decided, okay, remote work works for us as well. So are we going to need office space? I think unequivocally yes. After a year of working remotely, I think most people out there are getting pretty tired of it. Yes, there are the folks that have said, hey, I have discovered that working in my bunny slippers every day really works for me. This is exactly where I want to be. That's great. But there's a lot of folks that have said that, no, I need that social interaction. And from a corporate perspective or a business perspective too, the innovation, the company culture that gets developed by people being able to be in person, I think is still very critical and will become critical. So I think that yes, office space is still very relevant in our market, that in general, in the long run, that office will come back just fine, but it's going to be different. And I think that companies are definitely reevaluating their office space needs, as will happen, because there could be that it's going to be more of a hybrid model, as opposed to either you are back in the office or not, but rather some mix of the two. And so, but I do think that office is indeed going to come back reasonably well. On the industrial side, yes, we have seen an increase in the vacancy rate here, but it's been mainly going up because we have built oh so much new industrial space. So 2021 will be the 5th year of the completion of 5 million square feet of new industrial space or better. This is e-commerce. This is our logistics operations, all of the online shopping that people have been doing, as opposed to some of that in-person shopping, has been fueling this whole industrial space need that is happening within our marketplace. But also, as I had mentioned, that we have many manufacturing companies that have also been expanding the aerospace, bioscience, food and beverage, that has also been fueling the need for more industrial space in our market. But it has definitely been predominantly a logistics driven expansion in our industrial space. And this is expected to continue. Now, I don't expect that we're going to continue to build 5 million square feet or more every single year here. But nonetheless, the importance of industrial and the strength of the industrial market is likely to continue into the near future here. Retail, however, has been a very different story. This is where we have seen the vacancy rate has notched up pretty rapidly. And we're seeing a real pullback in construction activity, which certainly makes sense. I think the big question for our retailers and restaurants is, what is this going to look like when we go back to this quote unquote normal? What will it look like for our operations? And certainly the retailers are trying to figure this out. I would suggest that the smart retailers are the ones that are going to be having both a physical presence, recognizing that people will still want to touch and feel things as they make those purchases, but also that they are going to marry that with a very strong online presence as well. This whole COVID recession has really accelerated that shift to online spending and all that. It was already a trend, it was already happening, but that whole trend really got accelerated with the COVID recession. So I think for retailers and indeed for our restaurants, it's going to be a matter of figuring out those new methods for getting that final good, that final service into their customers' hands there. Construction remained at a very strong pace throughout 2020, even though we saw in terms of the amount of square footage being completed went down a little bit in 2020. So we had about 7.5 million square feet that was completed in 2020. There remains a lot under construction, a lot of that happened that will push a lot of those completions into 2021. So in 2021, we expect about 10 million square feet of office, industrial, and retail to be added in the Metro Denver marketplace. This is down a little bit from our record year in 2018 when we had 11.5 million square feet. So still very strong construction activity within the marketplace. So let's turn now to our consumer activity and talk about the different experiences our consumers have had. So population changes, I know, are really critical to you all as you get out there and sell your homes. I mean, as we look at the components of population growth, recall that it is both net migration, which are the gray bars on top, that's the number of people moving in, less the number of people moving out, versus the natural increase, which are the green bars, which are births less deaths. So in 2020, we had one of the slowest population growth rates that we have had in a number of years. And it wasn't just here in Colorado, it wasn't just here in Metro Denver, it was all across the country. At a national level, the US population increased by 0.35%. That was it. That was the slowest rate of population growth in the US since the year 1900. In Colorado, our population increased by 1%. It was the slowest that we've seen since 1990. Metro Denver, similar story. Our population increased by about 1.2%. Again, one of the slowest rates of growth that we have seen in a few decades here. So what happened? Why this slow growth? Well, first of all, I think one of the reasons, again, we take a look at natural increase, this green bar here, we had an increase in deaths in Metro Denver, in Colorado, all across the country. We also had a lower birth rate. So we not only did we have decreased births, but also increased deaths, meaning that that whole natural increase in the population was at one of our slowest paces, on record here practically. The expectation is we'll see a little bit of a bump up in that natural increase in 2021, but it really does not start to level out to a level that is kind of similar to where it had been until about the middle of the decade. In terms of net migration, there's been a lot of discussion about, have people been moving to more suburban areas, more rural areas? Are they trying to get out of our dense core areas? Are they moving at all? And certainly, in terms of net migration activity, it was way, way different than where it had been back in 2015, which was one of our peak years of growth. Yes, we still had net migration. Yes, we still had more people moving into the area than moving out, but we were seeing a pullback in mobility all across the country. Despite that, Metro Denver did certainly remain one of those areas that was very attractive to people that were indeed taking the big plunge and moving households, moving locations during that period of time. Indeed, Colorado was still the 12th fastest growing state in 2020, despite, again, the very slower types of growth rates that were being experienced all across the country. And I think that another cause perhaps for this low population growth rate, it was also from a federal administration side, we were not allowing as much international migration into the US in the last few years. And certainly that has restricted the population growth that we have had nationally and in Colorado and in Metro Denver. One of the important things to understand, though, about our population is how it falls out in terms of our generational groups. And I don't bring this up because, I'm trying to create any type of angst between the different generational groups or anything, but it's important to understand our whole composition because this has a dramatic influence on our potential spending patterns, as well as, yep, you guessed it, home sales. So millennials are our largest generational group in Metro Denver right now, with about 820,000 millennials living in Metro Denver. And notice that these peak the largest numbers of millennials are not just now hitting on that 30-year age mark. So if, recognizing that home ownership, yes, we've been kind of seeing this whole, what age do you become a homeowner has gotten a little bit older over the past years. Nonetheless, these millennials are moving into this whole home ownership arena right about now, which means that I know you guys were incredibly busy in 2020, but I think you're going to continue to be busy into 2021 because of the activity that is happening with these millennials. Now, so that's important from the whole home ownership standpoint. I also want to point out the strength of the boomers and also the strength of the Gen Xers here. These groups are important because those two generational groups are where you tend to see more of the assets being concentrated, more of the wealth being concentrated, which makes sense. Because certainly if you think about those millennials, they're just starting out in the careers, just starting to develop their whole wealth portfolio, versus the boomers. That's where you have 50% of the assets are owned by the boomer households. Gen Xers also having a good chunk of that, all of those assets there, all of that wealth. Versus when we take a look at the liabilities, we're starting to see that home mortgages are now becoming a growing part of the boomer portfolio or balance sheet, I guess I should say, versus a lot of that mortgage debt is being held by the Gen Xers, a little bit less certainly by the boomers. So it's important to understand this whole generational grouping here because, again, who are going to be your key housing purchasers in the years to come, and also who is going to fuel this recovery? Who has the money? Who has the wealth to fuel the recovery? And certainly when we look at those assets, again, that those concentrations of baby boomers and Gen Xers and the fact that they own more of the assets here is really critical too, to the idea of where we can be 4 months, 6 months from now. Who has the dollars to be out there spending? So our spending patterns have shifted very, very dramatically. With this whole COVID recession, we have seen an over 20% increase in the spending, which is referred to as non-store retailers, which is Economist geek speak for e-commerce. So this 20% increase in e-commerce activities. We've also seen increases in food and beverage store spending. That's, your grocery stores, your liquor stores. We've also seen increases in spending in building materials and garden equipment and supplies. We've been spending more time at home, and so we're thinking, oh, it's time to spruce something up here. So certainly all of those home improvement projects have benefited those building materials types of providers out there. On the downside, if you are in a retail or service sector that is providing food services and drinking places, or that would be our bars and restaurants, spending in your establishments has again been very, very challenged in 2020. If you're a gas station owner, spending at gas stations has been down significantly because we've not been driving as much. Also helped by the fact that the price of gasoline was lower during that period of time, but also just in terms of volume of purchases too has been down. And clothing accessories down as well, because why bother? If all anybody sees is my Zoom shirt, why do I need to spend a lot of dollars there? Here in Colorado, our spending patterns have been even more constrained than what we have seen happening at the US level. So if we take a look at the data then and break it out by slightly different categories here than the prior chart, we see that yes, in general, retail spending and grocery store spending in Colorado has increased, but our increases have been less than what have happened at the national level. Again, that's showing to me the importance of those tourism dollars that have been absent within our marketplace. On the healthcare side, yes, our healthcare workers have been true heroes throughout this past year. Nonetheless, spending in healthcare establishments is lower because primarily because we have not been spending those dollars on elective types of procedures, which many of our hospitals and other healthcare providers really depend upon for their bread and butter operations. And if we were to focus on those high touch types of industries, that's where we really see, again, the influence that COVID has had on our spending patterns. Restaurants, hotels spending throughout the state of Colorado down by 29%. Transportation spending, that's very significantly the aviation expenditures there, down by 53%. And entertainment and recreation down by 69%. Oh, how we miss going out to hear live music, going out to a live sporting event, going out to a movie, going out to a theater, a museum, all of those activities spending down significantly. And again, notice that our spending patterns in Colorado have been even more constrained than what had been happening at the national level. Zeroing in on overall spending in a retail trade spending in Colorado, when we add in all of the various categories, Colorado spending up by about 6.6%, Metro Denver up by a slower 3% rate. And part of that, I think, is if you focus on Denver here, or even Arapahoe County there, we have seen a shift in where those spending patterns have been happening. So the city and county of Denver, our downtown Denver core, relied very heavily upon those workers that were all congregating in our urban core for their working day and spending those dollars. Now that that has not been happening, people are spending their dollars closer to where they live. So you have areas like Douglas County, Jefferson County, where you've had stronger increases in retail spending than other areas, because those are two counties that tend to be more dominated by where people live than where people are working. So it's been a very different type of experience here. All right, wrapping it up now, let's talk about what's happening on residential real estate. Boy, as I said, you guys were busy in 2020. In 2020, we saw an increase in sales activity. I mean, making 2020 the year of the largest number of home sales transactions in Metro Denver's history, nearly 63,000 homes that changed hands then in 2020. Going back to that whole millennial idea, that concentration of millennials, Lending Tree had done a survey where they identified Denver as being the third hottest market for the millennial home buyer. And certainly a big chunk of those home sales activities that were happening were, again, in a householder that would fall within that whole millennial generational group there. Our expectation is that 2021 will still be a busy year. You're not going to get the 7% increase in home sales activity that you had in 2020, but we are still thinking that it will be a strong year for sales activity, but maybe increasing by that 1.5% rate. What has dominated the conversation here too, though, not just the extreme number of sales, but how that low interest rate has really helped to foster a very strong active market, and the low inventory that has dominated the whole sales environment. You know, I don't need to tell you guys this, but inventory levels down by 50% compared to where they had been even the year before. That it's, you know, I'm sure you are coaching any of your buyers to make those offers right away, those sellers to be prepared to have that home trade hands very, very quickly. Again, the restricted inventory has certainly been one of the key trends that we have been tracking. Well, because of very strong demand, because of very restricted supply, we continue to see our home prices appreciate here. So in the Metro Denver market, you know, we have seen that those home prices have continued to increase, but the increase in our home prices was not quite as strong as it had been at a national level. And from an economic development perspective, this was really exciting news. So in 2020, we saw the median home price at the US level increase by 9%. In the Metro Denver market, that green line, the prices increased by just under the median price increased by just under 7%. In Boulder, it increased just a little over 4%. The fact that this differential then between our US median home price and our home prices minimized by even just a little bit is kind of good news for us here. Because, you know, the Boulder market being the seventh most expensive metropolitan statistical area right now, Metro Denver being no great bargain ourselves at currently, I believe, 14. boy, that has just been really challenging as companies are trying to make decisions about where they can grow and expand their operations. There is always the question of, can our people afford to live in that marketplace? I want to just also point out that as we've been talking about these divides and what we have experienced during these COVID times, recognize too that the home prices vary significantly all across our state of Colorado. So if you are working in the mountain resort communities, you know that your home prices are significantly higher. Here we have Eagle County with a median home price of nearly $1.2 million, versus if you are here in the Eastern Plains, represented by Morgan County and Bent County, those home prices are significantly lower. Bent County, I believe their home price was something like $123,000, a median home price. Of course, they don't have many sales out there. And of course, that home price had nearly doubled compared to where it had been. But again, a wide variety of home prices. And that's been one of the attractions, I guess, of the Western Slope, going back to that whole idea that Grand Junction had been posting the least amount of job losses in the state of Colorado of our urbanized areas. Their home prices also tend to be much more affordable, which has been a reason to continue to see some inflow of new population within that region there. The apartment market, just to touch upon that, has been acting a little bit differently, even on the single family side, where we continue to see strong appreciation in our home prices. On the apartment side, we're starting to see more leveling off of those apartment prices. In fact, we only saw about a 0.5% increase overall in the Metro Denver marketplace in terms of that apartment lease rate there. Vacancy rate increased though just a little bit, still very, very healthy level of vacancy within our market, very healthy level of activity within our apartment market. So a lot of discussion there though about, are we going to see people moving out? Well, we did see more people moving out of the downtown core. I mean, that's where we've seen higher vacancy rates would be now, those vacancy rates have been increasing a little more rapidly in the Denver marketplace as opposed to some of the suburban marketplaces. But is that a trend that's going to hold or not? I think that's the big question. Our expectation, though, is that we will see a little more stability in our home prices and in our apartment rates as we look out to 2021, because we have indeed been adding the inventory to match the population growth. There were many years where, think back to the Great Recession when we were building next to nothing. So here in this 2009 to 2011 period, but yet we still had a growing population. Versus now, our population growth is slowing, but we're still building at a pretty high level. In general, if we're building about 17,000 new units each year, that's about where we need to be to meet the population growth. Again, with population growth being a little bit lower over the next few years, again, we are still building at a very healthy level. And that, I think, is going to be easing some of those supply concerns out there, and perhaps then making it that we see a little more, dare I say, affordability within our marketplace here. So with that, all right, I want to hear from you guys. What else do you want to talk about, or any other questions, comments, topics? I'm all ears.
Hey, Patty, thank you for that fire hose effect of data and great overview of what's kind of happening large, small, and in the Metro Denver area. Really appreciate that. What I will say is we actually have a variety of industries present here, not just real estate, which is fantastic. So I know we do have folks, you mentioned aerospace, the second largest concentration. I know we have some aerospace folks here You have people in the financial and professional services, students, so it's pretty neat to see you kind of touch on all those things with some of the various people that are present, and hopefully they took away some good things there.
Good, good.
Yeah, I think I don't have any specific questions. Well, I guess would we be able to get the slides as well?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay,
So
great.
after this presentation, Drew, I will be sending you a PDF, and please feel free to share that with your attendees or whoever you feel appropriate.
Absolutely. That's great. I sure will. I'll send that out to everybody. Just for the group, if anybody is curious to ask something or wants to revisit a slide, I mean, we've got a couple minutes left. Happy to look at that. So chime in, and also to kind of touch on the real estate side. In case you didn't know, I'm a real estate agent. I lead the Modern West group here in Denver. And if you want to dive into any specific real estate stats for an area, or to kind of build on some of the things that Patty talked about, especially on the building side, the permits, and how that's kind of affected prices as well, and what we can expect. I mean, anything you want to look at, reach out. We're happy to talk about that. We've got plenty of resources to deepen that discussion as well. So let's see. Okay, we got a comment here. Oh, Dietrich. Awesome.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you for that. That was a really interesting presentation, because I've read, some speculation and things like that in the news. So to see the actual impact across all those different industries was very informative.
Good. Thank you. Thank you. I'm glad it was useful to you. Yeah, I mean, that to me has been just the huge story of this, is just, again, how differently this is impacting people depending upon what your livelihood is.
Right. Yeah, it was actually I loved how you broke that out into the super sectors, because I've seen a lot of things over the year with, from the Wall Street Journal and how they've broken out different industries, but to have it specific to Denver Metro is super helpful. And it really validates a lot of the things that I see just in my industry for the people that are in the market and where they're coming from. It all makes a lot of sense. So it's great to see that data.
Good. Yeah.
One question I have for you, just for what you do in your company, obviously you give a lot of presentations to folks and you work with Metro Denver EDC. What kind of services do you offer for people, for companies, for developers, for just business leadership that we should know about? I'm curious.
Well, thank you for that little opportunity to tell you all a little bit about us. So we have 4 main areas of expertise: the economic and demographic studies. So, again, sharing the type of information that I have shared with you this evening. And we also help communities kind of establish what we would call their community profiles. So as they're trying to market their region to businesses or what have you, we help them to put that information together. We also do a lot of various industry studies. So as part of the economic development strategy for Metro Denver, for example, we have 9 key industries that we focus on here. And so we do in-depth studies of those so that they can be prepared, that those economic developers can really be prepared to say why you should come to my area if you are in aerospace or aviation or bioscience or energy or all of our key industries. We also, for developers out there, we do economic and fiscal impact studies. So if you have a project that you are trying to get approved within a local community and they're requiring some type of economic fiscal impact study, we do those. And then we also do various other specialized real estate studies. My business partner has a long history in the commercial real estate market and helps a lot of communities figure out how to redevelop certain properties and what's missing within the community from a development aspect. So thank you for asking.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. Awesome. Well, any other questions from the group? Anything that we can touch on?
Hey, Patty, I've got a question for you. My name is Jade Buckler. I'm a military service member. I've lived out in California. I'm currently in Tennessee, and I'm looking to move to Colorado. And my question is, you've touched on this a little bit, but just I'm curious about what you are forecasting as far as sort of a demographic shift in light of the economic points you've talked to. So to kind of further drill down on this, looking at the different wage groups that you had broken out, and the higher wage earners are relatively healthier, have remained relatively recovered, I guess, fairly quickly. You touched on like manufacturing jobs and their kind of where they stand, but the lower wage earners, I'm curious if you are sort of forecasting any issues with people returning to those types of jobs. And I recognize that those help drive some of those other industries, but I'll shut up now and let you dive into that. Thanks for your time.
Sure. When the vaccine has become widespread, when that herd immunity has been achieved, when we start to see people really feeling comfortable being out there again, I do think that folks within our leisure and hospitality industries, our retail industries, some of those lower wage industries are going to be back in demand. However, my concern is that even as these companies start to scale up again, will they have the resources to bring people on again quickly? So, for example, many of our companies here in Colorado, all across the country, have relied very heavily upon the Paycheck Protection Programs, the PPP loans, that have had very specific purposes. But what about those, and that has helped to keep some of those various companies at least afloat during this period of time. But once we're trying to open everything back up again, will there be the loan amounts? Will those companies have the resources that are needed to scale up in terms of their inventory, once again, in terms of being able to bring those workers back in a quick manner? So that's, I think, really one of the key reasons why I think that the recovery takes, again, I mean, any recovery takes a while. I mean, the Great Recession, it took us 38 months to add back all of the jobs that were lost. I think this one will be a little bit quicker, but nonetheless, it still takes time to ramp everything up. So even as our low wage workers have been the ones that have been most significantly impacted through the COVID recession, I think they're also going to be the ones that are going to potentially experience the challenges in getting those jobs again. So I think we as a community really need to be thinking about how are we going to help support the low wage workers through this whole transition period of time. And that was kind of a long-winded answer, but there you go.
No, yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Awesome. It looks like we could probably touch on one more question, and it looks like Dietrich asked if you could speculate on the effect that the repeal of the Gallagher Amendment may have on business activity in the coming year.
So great question. So the Gallagher Amendment, for those of you who may not know, here in Colorado with our property tax, we had to maintain a 45-55 split in terms of the residential value versus commercial value. Or do I have that backwards now? Anyway, the split in terms of the assessed valuation. So what was happening then, our residential assessment ratio was basically going down and down and down, but our non-residential assessment ratio was fixed at 29%. I think right now it's like 7.15 on the residential side, 29% on the business side. And so it was really felt like it was being unjust to our business community, and that they were paying 4 times the amount of property tax basically than a residential unit. As rates were triggered or changed, so first of all, the first positive from this is that we do feel like this at least will, even though it's not shifting the business assessment ratio, even though it's kind of freezing that residential assessment ratio, at least we prevent a deterioration in that. Where this has been incredibly harmful, even more so than our urbanized areas, has been in rural Colorado, where those assessment ratios for residential properties have kept going down and down and down, which means that their tax bases have been significantly eroded, because they were not, even all of the residential properties that were added were mainly in the urbanized areas, not in rural Colorado. So as that assessment ratio went down, they were seeing a decline in their property tax revenue. So we hope that that puts the brakes on the deterioration of that revenue base as well, because our rural parts of the state depend so much on that property tax revenue for their school districts, as well as all of the various other services. And they were seeing this whole erosion in their property tax bases because of what was going on in urbanized areas, because that 45-55 split was established based on the state as a whole, not individual communities. So we definitely see this as as putting the stop, if you will. I mean, it's not going to turn it into an equitable system by any stretch of the imagination overnight, but at least we have stopped the deterioration.
All right. All right. Awesome. So yeah, Dietrich said, thanks for your insight. Well, awesome. I think that takes us to the end of our session tonight. Again, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your information. Thank you for everybody that came out and wanted to learn a little bit more about what's happening here in the Denver metro area. Of course, if you have any more questions, you want to dive into more things, reach out to Patty. Her email's there on the screen. And Patty, if you have anything else you want to share, let us know. But other than that, say thanks to everybody. I hope you guys all have a great night, and I'll get those slides over as soon as I have them.
I'll get them right on out to you. Hang in there, everybody. We'll get through this.
Awesome. Thanks, Patty. Really appreciate it. Have a great night.
Take care. Bye-bye.